Thank you so much for all you do. It simply wouldn't work without you, and thank you for going on to inspire so many young people. To all the supporters here today, thank you.
The date is March 25th, 2026. Somewhere inside Buckingham Palace, a formal note is being drafted. Not a press release, not a public announcement. A quiet, short, controlled piece of paper that the people writing it desperately hoped would never need to exist. And when it arrived at Bagshot Park, it confirmed something the British monarchy had spent years trying to avoid putting in writing. Prince Edward had won. Not just won a dispute. Not just held his ground in a family argument. He had forced the crown, the institution that defines British identity, that projects authority across the world, that never admits it was wrong, to back down completely. In writing, on the record, forever. But here's the question you need to sit with before we go any further. How does a man who spent decades being dismissed as the quiet one, the least notable Windsor, the prince nobody worried about, how does that man build a legal case so airtight that even King Charles III's own lawyers couldn't find a single crack in it? Because that's exactly what happened. And the answer takes us all the way back to a dying prince, a queen who knew her time was running out, and documents signed in the shadow of grief that nobody inside that palace expected to matter this much. Stay with this. Because what unfolded on March 25th, 2026, didn't just shake the royal family. It rewrote the rules about what a king can actually do. The promise that started everything. To understand why March 25th hit the way it did, you have to go back to who Queen Elizabeth II was in her final years. Not the ceremonial figure, not the composed woman standing on the balcony at Trooping the Colour, the private Elizabeth, the mother, the woman who had watched her family fracture publicly, repeatedly, painfully, and who had spent the last chapter of her life trying to make sure the damage stopped with her. By 2021, she had already lost too much. Andrew had become radioactive. Harry had walked. The tabloids were running daily updates on whatever fresh Windsor disaster had just emerged. And through all of it, one son had stayed clean. One son had shown up, done the work, kept his head down, and never once handed the press a headline they could weaponize. Edward. So when Elizabeth began making her final decisions, the ones that would outlast her, Edward was the one she thought about most carefully. The Duke of Edinburgh title had been Prince Philip's identity for over 70 years. It wasn't just an honor. It was the shape of his entire life's work, his contribution, his legacy compressed into a name. And Elizabeth knew, with the certainty of a woman who had watched men fight over far lesser things, that without proper protection, that title could be stripped, reassigned, or quietly diminished the moment she was no longer there to defend it. So she made a decision. And she didn't just make it verbally, she documented it. The title would go to Edward, and it would go with teeth. That promise became real in April 2023, when King Charles III officially conferred the Dukedom of Edinburgh on his youngest brother. In that moment, it looked like a smooth, dignified transition, a family honoring its own history. But what the cameras didn't show was the second part of that inheritance, the part that didn't come with a ceremony, the part that came with paperwork. Because tied to that title was a property. And that property was about to become the most contested piece of real estate in the entire British monarchy. The house that Edward built. Ask yourself something. If someone handed you the keys to a crumbling 120-room mansion and told you the rent was £5,000 a year, but the catch was that you had to fund the repairs yourself immediately and bring it back to a standard fit for royal use, would you take that deal? Most people wouldn't. But in March 1998, that was exactly the arrangement placed in front of Prince Edward. And he said yes. Bagshot Park is not just a house. It sits on 51 acres inside Windsor Great Park. It is a Tudor Gothic mansion with the kind of presence that makes people slow their cars down when they drive past. It is the seat of the Dukedom of Edinburgh. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the great royal properties in England. But in 1998, it was a disaster. The building had been abandoned. An army chaplain's residence before Edward, it had been left to deteriorate while the Crown Estate quietly explored other options. And those options, documented at the time, included turning the entire property into a hotel or conference center. That was how little the institution valued it. Not enough to maintain it, not enough to invest in it, enough to hand it off and collect whatever rent they could. Edward took it. And then he did something remarkable. He spent £1.36 million of his own money, private funds, money he had earned himself before stepping into full-time royal duties. He poured it into that building. Total restoration costs reached nearly £3 million. The Crown Estate contributed their share, but Edward carried a serious financial burden that the institution he was serving was not required to cover. When the work was done, his rent was reassessed at £90,000 per year. The National Audit Office confirmed that, as fair market value, he paid it. Every year, without complaint, without negotiation, without trying to find a way around it. Now think about that for a moment, because while Edward was paying market rate and funding his own restoration work, his brother Andrew was sitting at Royal Lodge under completely different terms. The National Audit Office documented it clearly. One prince followed the rules, the other did not. And the institution that allowed that double standard to exist for years was about to turn its attention to the one who had done everything right. But Edward had gone even further than anyone realized. In 2007, he paid £5 million through his company, Eclipse Nominees Limited, to extend his lease to 150 years. Not a short-term arrangement, not a tentative foothold, a generational commitment. He locked himself into that property for life and beyond. He built himself the right to sell the lease and retain the profit. He created control that no royal decree could easily unwind. By 2026, that property was worth approximately £30 million. And suddenly, the modernization agenda being pushed from inside Buckingham Palace had a very clear financial motive attached to it. The pressure builds. Here's where you need to pay attention, because this is the part that most people on the outside couldn't see while it was happening. Charles had come to the throne in September 2022 with a vision: a slimmed-down monarchy, fewer working royals, tighter finances, more central control over how the institution projected itself. Those were the stated goals. Reasonable on the surface, sensible even if you accepted the premise that the monarchy needed to modernize to survive. But a stated goal and the actual mechanics of achieving it are two very different things. And by 2026, those mechanics had started to look less like reform and more like consolidation. Royal leases were under review. Financial audits were being conducted behind closed doors. Quiet pressure was being applied to how members of the family lived, what they held, and what they owed the central institution for the privilege of holding it. Bagshot Park became a target. And when it did, the people applying that pressure encountered something they clearly hadn't anticipated. They encountered a man who had been preparing for exactly this moment since 1998. Because Queen Elizabeth II, in her final years, had done something that Prince Philip had pushed her to do. She had written a letter of intent, a document tying Bagshot Park directly to the Edinburgh title for Edward's lifetime, a document that was witnessed by Prince Philip himself as he was dying. Think about that for a moment. A man in the final weeks of his life, watching everything he had built begin to shift around him, took the time to put his name on a document designed to protect his youngest son from an institution he knew could be quietly ruthless when it chose to be. Philip had spent more than 70 years inside the machinery of the British monarchy. He had watched it move against people it no longer found useful. He had seen how the quiet pressure worked, how you didn't need to break rules to break a person. You just needed to make their position unstable, their support uncertain, and their home insecure. He was not going to allow that to happen to Edward, so he signed the letter, and Edward kept it, kept the original lease, kept every financial record from every repair, every payment, every audit. 20 years of documentation, building a file that nobody inside the palace had anticipated existed. The tiara. But it didn't start with the property. It started with something smaller, something more personal, and in many ways, something more revealing about exactly what was driving this pressure. Earlier in 2026, before the lawyers arrived with their dossier, a palace official appeared at the Edinburgh household. The visit was framed as routine, a jewelry audit, a national heritage review, standard procedure. That's how it was described. What it actually was, stripped of the careful language, was someone arriving with a clipboard to question jewelry that Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had worn as her own for 25 years. And at the center of that audit was one piece, the anthem tiara. This was not a random item from a shared royal vault. It was made specifically for Sophie's wedding in 1999, commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II herself, built using 4 antique elements shaped in a honeysuckle design, taken from the private collection of Queen Victoria. It was Elizabeth's personal gift to the woman her youngest son was marrying. For nearly 2 decades, it was the only tiara Sophie regularly wore. And that detail matters more than it might seem. Sophie was never granted the kind of open access to grand state tiaras that other senior royals enjoyed. That was understood within the family, never announced, never formally stated, but clear. The anthem tiara was her crown, the one piece that was entirely hers. Now that piece was being questioned. The argument coming from the palace was legal in its framing. Because the tiara contained stones from Queen Victoria's era, it could potentially be reclassified as crown property. That would mean moving it to the central royal vault and requiring Sophie to request permission each time she wanted to wear it. Her own wedding tiara, a gift from the woman who was as close to a mother as she had ever known. Requiring permission. But here's the thread you need to pull. Because if that argument holds, if a personal gift from the monarch can be reclassified as crown property based on its historical components, then where does it stop? Every piece of jewelry Elizabeth gave over her 70-year reign becomes vulnerable. Every personal gift becomes subject to review, and Queen Camilla's own collection, which came substantially from royal sources, falls directly into the same trap. The logic of that argument devoured itself. Edward's legal team saw it immediately. But they weren't just going to point out the contradiction, they were going to shut it down completely. They produced a deed of gift, signed by Elizabeth in 1999. It classified the anthem tiara explicitly as a private wedding present. Not a state loan, not a shared asset, not held in trust. It belonged to Sophie. Full stop. But Edward had gone further. In 1999, he had worked with royal jewelers to create a matching set of pearl jewelry for Sophie. A necklace and earrings designed to complement the anthem tiara exactly. The materials were funded through the crown, but Edward held the design rights personally. His lawyers argued that the tiara and the pearl set constituted a single artistic unit tied to his own design work. Remove the tiara, and you fracture that unit. And that gave him a legal dimension nobody had anticipated. There was also something else in that file. Something about a public moment that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with truth. In October 2019, at a reception in Buckingham Palace marking the work of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust, Sophie was giving a speech. In the middle of that speech, in front of senior royals and assembled guests, she turned to look at Queen Elizabeth II and said, without planning it, without thinking, "Mama." It slipped out. In a room where every word is controlled, where every gesture is calculated, it slipped out. And it said everything about who these two women were to each other. The woman who signed that deed of gift was the woman Sophie called her mother. And now another woman was trying to use legal language to take that away. By the afternoon of March 25th, Edward's lawyers delivered a direct warning. If the claim on the tiara was not dropped by end of day, they would release private letters written by Elizabeth. Letters that stated, clearly and personally, her wish for Sophie to retain full ownership of her jewelry. And according to those close to the situation, those letters did not stop at the tiara. They included words about Camilla. The implications of that were explosive. Charles had spent years rehabilitating Camilla's image, turning her from one of the most unpopular figures in British public life into queen consort. It had been a long, careful, difficult process. Elizabeth's documented feelings about Camilla, the long years of cold distance, the tension that never fully disappeared, the reluctant acceptance that came only near the end, those were things Charles had worked hard to leave in the past. Those letters could bring them back in a single afternoon. Anne walks in. This is where everything changes, because up to this point, the fight had been legal. Documents against documents, lawyers against lawyers, paper against paper. And then Princess Anne walked into a private room inside Buckingham Palace. To understand why that moment shifted everything, you have to understand that Anne and Sophie were not always close. As recently as 2021, the distance between them was visible. Anne doesn't perform warmth. She never has. If she doesn't feel it, she doesn't show it. That's been her entire public life. But April 2021 changed the structure inside the family. Philip died. And in the grief that followed, both Anne and Sophie stepped forward to support Queen Elizabeth II through her final year. They began seeing each other almost daily. The distance between them closed, slowly and then completely. By the time of Elizabeth's funeral in September 2022, the change was there for anyone paying attention. As they stood waiting for the coffin, Sophie reached out and placed a quiet hand on Anne's back. A small gesture, barely visible, but real. And in a family that runs on controlled appearances, real gestures carry enormous weight. By March 2026, that quiet connection had become something protective and ready to move. So when Anne walked into that meeting with King Charles III, she was not there as a sister trying to mediate. She was there as a woman who had reviewed every document in Edward's file and decided that what was happening was wrong. She went straight to the point. She told Charles that if he allowed this to continue, if he allowed private gifts from their mother to be questioned, reclassified, or retrieved, then the word of a monarch meant nothing. And then she said something that stopped the room. If our mother's signature on a lease or a deed of gift is not worth the paper it's written on today, then your signature will be worth even less tomorrow. That is not a diplomatic line. That is not a sister trying to smooth things over. That is a direct attack on the foundation of royal authority itself. A king's power rests entirely on trust. The trust that what he signs will be honored. That trust doesn't begin with him. It flows from every monarch before him. Every document, every promise, every recorded decision made by every sovereign who came before creates the credibility that makes the current monarch's word mean anything at all. Break that chain, and you don't just dishonor your mother, you weaken yourself. Anne had also reviewed the Bagshot Park documents personally. She knew what Edward had paid. She knew what terms the Crown Estate had accepted. She knew exactly what a 150-year lease meant in legal terms. And she made her position clear. Edward paid for that home. The Crown Estate accepted his money under those terms. That agreement stands. There is nothing left to argue. She didn't treat the tiara and the house as separate disputes. She made it explicit. They were the same fight. Both were personal gifts from Elizabeth, both backed by signed legal documents, and both were now being challenged using the same logic. If they succeed in taking one, the door opens for the other. And once that door opens, nothing their mother ever signed is safe. Then she went further. She told Charles that if the pressure continued, specifically if Camilla's office continued pushing, she would act. Not privately, publicly. She would oversee a full audit of the Queen's household, not a surface-level review of basic numbers. Everything. Expenses, staffing, allocations connected directly to Queen Camilla. That threat was not empty. Anne is the one person in that family with the credibility to make it real. She has a decades-long record of financial discipline and public accountability. If she says she will expose something, people believe her. The press believes her. The public believes her. She has never been caught in a manufactured story or a polished deception. She also addressed Edward's children directly. There had been quiet pressure building to push James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor into full private status earlier than their parents, or they themselves, had decided. That would mean stepping away from protected royal positioning and losing the security that comes with it. Anne shut it down immediately. She had chosen a private life for her own children, Peter and Zara, years ago. But that was her choice, made freely, without institutional pressure, without anyone deciding the timeline for her. What she was watching now was different. It was external pressure being applied to children who had not made that choice, and she was not going to stand by while that happened. By the time she walked out of that room, Charles had no clean options left. Back Camilla and risk destroying the credibility of his own authority, or step back and accept that some things his mother decided are simply beyond his reach. There was no good version of either choice. The legal verdict. After Anne's meeting, after the dossier had been reviewed in full, King Charles III's own legal team delivered their conclusion. Prince Edward's position was virtually unbreakable. Every document held, the original lease, the financial records, the letter of intent witnessed by Philip, the deed of gift for the tiara, 20 years of maintenance records showing the Crown had benefited from Edward's stewardship of the estate. Every single piece of the file stood up under scrutiny. And then came the detail that reportedly hit Charles hardest of all. He had known his mother always protected Edward and Sophie. He had understood where her loyalty sat within the private dynamics of the family. But he had not known that Philip, in the final stage of his life, had formally backed that protection in writing. He had not known about the witnessed letter. That changed the entire character of what he was looking at, because it wasn't just Elizabeth acting to protect her youngest son, it was both of them, together, in the final chapter of their lives, making sure that what they had built for Edward and Sophie would survive them. Charles had believed, since conferring the dukedom in April 2023, that he retained some residual authority over what came with it. That as the king who granted the title, he still held a degree of control over its context and surroundings. His own lawyers told him in writing that he did not. What his mother gave Edward was not temporary, it was not conditional, it was not subject to royal review or modernization agendas. It was a legal inheritance, properly documented, witnessed by two of the most senior members of the monarchy, and it was entirely out of his reach. The handwritten note and the response. When the law failed him, Charles stepped outside it. He wrote a private note, handwritten, sent directly to Bagshot Park, not through lawyers, not through palace channels, a personal message asking for a family meeting. Think about what that means. This is a sitting monarch, a king who can command rooms, direct institutions, and shape the narrative of an entire nation, writing a handwritten note to his younger brother asking to talk. Because the formal channels had failed him completely. The response he received made the situation absolutely clear. Edward would not meet without his full legal team present. That single response changed everything that followed. Because it told Charles, and everyone watching inside the palace, that this was no longer a family disagreement. It was no longer the kind of thing that gets smoothed over at a private dinner or buried in the comfortable silence of Windsor protocol. Edward was no longer operating as the younger brother trying to maintain peace. He was operating as a man who understood precisely what was at risk and refused to surrender any part of it without documentation and protection. And once a line like that is drawn in a family like this one, it does not get undrawn. The palace divides. Here is what the public could not see while the legal battle was being resolved. Inside the palace, sides were forming. Staff members who had worked around Sophie and Edward for years began showing quiet support for the Edinburgh household. Resentment toward the Queen's office started spreading through palace corridors that had always been defined by careful, enforced silence. And where there are sides, there are leaks. Private discussions that should have stayed contained began moving toward the outside. Documents, internal notes, the shape of thinking that was supposed to remain within Buckingham Palace walls, all of it sat closer to exposure than it had ever been. The palace that built its entire identity on control was no longer controlling its own house. One insider, according to reports from those close to the situation, put it with devastating simplicity. The king is being led into a minefield. He is being pushed to choose between his wife's demands and his mother's final decisions. There is no outcome that does not damage the family. That is not a political problem. That is not an image management challenge. That is a structural fracture. And structural fractures in institutions like the British monarchy don't announce themselves loudly. They spread quietly, invisibly. And by the time anyone can see the damage clearly, the repair work is already impossible. There was also the public dimension, and that dimension was brutal. At a time when ordinary people across Britain were navigating rising costs, financial pressure, and the daily arithmetic of making ends meet, the image of a king trying to reclaim a home from his brother. A home that brother had personally funded, personally restored, personally maintained for nearly 3 decades. That image, if it fully broke into public view, would not land well. It would not be forgiven quickly. The monarchy's survival has always depended on its ability to read the public mood. And the public mood in 2026 had absolutely no appetite for watching a king strip assets from the one prince who had actually paid his own way. The confirmation. Late on March 25, 2026, a formal note was sent from the office of the Master of the Jewel House to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. It was short, direct. No emotion, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what had led to that moment. The anthem tiara would remain under her exclusive private control. That was it. At the same time, the review of Bagshot Park was shut down. The official language described it as recognition of the Edinburgh household's role in maintaining the estate. Clean, neutral language designed to give everyone a way to move forward without anyone having to say the word defeat out loud. But inside the palace, nobody misunderstood what had happened. The crown had stepped back. Everything Prince Edward held was confirmed. The title, the home, the tiara, all of it standing exactly where Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip had placed it, backed by documents that had survived every attempt to challenge them. And here is why that matters beyond the immediate outcome. That formal note will sit in the archives long after every person involved in this story is gone. When it is read in the future, and it will be read, it will be clear what it records. A claim was made. It failed. And the institution was forced to admit that failure in writing. What it cost. The outcome was clear. But outcomes in families like this are never clean. The relationship between King Charles III and Prince Edward has been permanently altered. Not visibly, not in the way the public will see it. They will continue to appear at the same events. They will stand in the same photographs. They will perform the unity that the monarchy requires. But inside the family, everyone will know what happened. They will know that one brother had to go to lawyers to protect himself from the other. They will know that the institution which raised them both, shaped them both, defined them both, became the weapon in that fight. That knowledge doesn't disappear. It doesn't get smoothed over by a handshake at a state occasion. It becomes part of the architecture of every interaction that follows. Two centers of power now exist inside the reduced Windsor structure. At Buckingham Palace, Charles and Camilla continue pressing their vision of a centralized, controlled, modernized monarchy. Away from that center, a different formation has emerged. Princess Anne, Prince Edward, Sophie. And according to those monitoring the family's internal dynamics, quietly supported by Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. They are not organizing loudly. They are not issuing statements. They are holding a line, protecting what was built before, refusing to allow it to be rewritten by people who weren't there when it was built. That divide is now fixed. It isn't going to close. And for James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor, both watching their father navigate this fight from close distance, the lesson will stay with them for life. They watched him win without drama, without public appeals, without using the press as a weapon. He built his case over years. He kept every document. He trusted the law over the institution. And when the moment came, he was ready. One day, James will carry the Duke of Edinburgh title, the same title his grandfather defined for over 70 years. But he will carry it with a knowledge that previous holders never had. He will know that the institution capable of giving can also try to take back. He will know that preparation is protection. He will know that sentiment means nothing without signatures. That knowledge will make him cautious in a way that changes everything about how he operates inside that system for the rest of his life. Charles has his monarchy. He has his structure. He has the authority that comes with the crown. But what he no longer has is the unchallenged belief that he controls everything within it. His mother built protections. His father witnessed them. His youngest brother spent 28 years quietly, methodically making them legally unassailable. And when the pressure finally came, when the institution turned its machinery toward the one Windsor who had done everything right, it found a wall it could not move. The palace had to put it in writing. And that moment, a king forced to admit in formal documentation that his mother's final decisions are beyond his reach, says more about the actual limits of royal power than anything that has happened inside that family in decades. Queen Elizabeth II is gone. But on March 25, 2026, her decisions won. Prince Philip is gone. But the document he signed as he was dying held. It held against lawyers. It held against palace pressure. It held against the king himself. And in a 120-room Tudor Gothic mansion, sitting on 51 acres in Surrey, a man who waited his entire life to inherit his father's name, a man the press never took seriously enough, a man the institution never feared enough, went to sleep that night with his home, his title, and his wife's tiara exactly where they had always been, exactly where his mother put them. If you've been watching this family for years, you already know that what happens quietly inside those walls matters infinitely more than what gets announced on the palace steps. And if you want to keep watching, because this story is far from finished, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the bell, because what comes next in this family is going to be even harder to look away from.